Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the National Defense Authorization Act, which we'll be processing this week, I hope. But in particular, I want to talk about a section 578. Section 578 is a provision designed to protect the children of our service members, and specifically to protect them when they're at school from convicted pedophiles and other dangerous felons. This is an issue I've been working on for 2.5 years, Mr. President. My involvement resulted from learning about a horrific story that is about a little boy named Jeremy Bell. The story begins at a school in Delaware County in southeastern Pennsylvania. A school teacher there had molested several boys, had raped one, and when the school officials and the local law enforcement figured out that something very, very wrong was going on, they unfortunately concluded that they just didn't have enough evidence. They didn't have a strong case they could bring against this teacher. So the school wanted to get rid of him, and tragically, they were okay with letting him become someone else's problem. So they wrote a letter of recommendation, which, with the understanding that he would leave. This monster took the letter of recommendation, went across the state line to West Virginia, got hired as a teacher, and several years later he had become principal. Of course, these people don't change their ways, and he didn't. He continued to molest and attack little boys. It ended when he raped and killed a 12-year-old boy named Jeremy Bell in West Virginia. Well, that time, Mr. President, justice caught up with this teacher. He's now serving a life sentence in jail for that murder, but of course, it's too late for Jeremy Bell. And tragically, Jeremy Bell's not alone. Since Joe Manchin and I first began this effort in this chamber 2.5 years ago, at least 1,150 school employees have been arrested across the country for sexual misconduct with the kids that they're supposed to be looking after, they're supposed to be caring for, they're supposed to be teaching. 1,150, Mr. President, that's more than one a day. And of course, those are the ones where the officials knew enough to feel confident that they could make an arrest and actually press charges. How many more? How many more cases are actually happening? And I would stress that these aren't just numbers. Every one of these 1,150 arrests represents just horrific tragedies, and in many cases, more than one. Consider a few examples from my state of Pennsylvania. Just this past January, the parents of children at Trinity High School in Washington County, they learned something absolutely horrific. They learned that a special education teacher there was charged with raping a little girl over a 15-year period, starting when she was just 3 years old. And they didn't discover this until she was 18. He'd raped another little girl who was only 6. Or consider the Phoenixville area middle school in Chester County. In November 2013, the school's principal was sentenced to 2 years in prison for having child pornography. A month later, a special education and math teacher at the school was arrested for possessing child pornography, some involving very, very young children. Mr. President, it's hard to even talk about these things. It's very uncomfortable to hear about this, to talk about this. But we can't shy away from this. I mean, if we think it's uncomfortable to think about it and to talk about it and hear about it, what about the experience for the child? The child's family? Every day it seems there's a new story. In Pittsburgh, Plum High School, 2 teachers have pled guilty to having sex with younger students. Third one's awaiting trial on related charges. The DA is investigating allegations that the school superintendent and principal might have ignored reports of abuse along the way. And another teacher has been charged with witness intimidation. He made one of the victims, a girl who was a victim, stand up in front of the class, and he mocked her because she brought the issue to the attention of the authorities. This is outrageous. This has to stop. And I have vowed that I'm going to do everything I can to try to provide greater security to our kids in our schools. Now, in this past December, we took a big step in the right direction, in my view, Mr. President. Congress passed legislation, and President Obama signed it into law. It was legislation in the broader education bill that we passed that had my legislation that now explicitly forbids knowingly recommending one of these monsters for hire. So exactly the circumstances that gave rise to the murder of Jeremy Bell, where a school knows they have a pedophile, they discover it, and they still send along a letter of recommendation so that he can become someone else's problem. That's now illegal, as well it should be. And it's not as rare as you might think. In fact, the practice is so common, it's well understood in the circles of child advocates and the people who prosecute these crimes and who defend children when they've been victimized by these crimes. It's so common that it even has its own name. It's called passing the trash. But unfortunately, when we got that piece of our legislation passed, we were not successful in persuading all of our colleagues that we also had to have another element to this. To really keep our kids safe, we need to make sure that we've got a rigorous background check that people aren't able to skirt, and we know that that does happen. So I promised that I would be back on the Senate floor to try to address this weakness, this loophole, the fact that we don't have consistently rigorous background checks to make sure that we're not hiring these creeps in the first place. Well, I am very happy to announce today that we, I think, are very close to taking another step forward. In this legislation, thanks to Chairman McCain, who just left the floor, but the senior senator from Arizona, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, incorporated into this legislation, the National Defense Authorization Bill, the bill that I introduced to protect our service members' children. And that's what it's called. It's called the Protect Our Service Members' Children Act. And it simply states that a school district that accepts impact money, and you know that's the funding that we approve here in Congress, runs through our Defense Department, and it goes to the school districts that are educating the children of our service members when they're on a base. Simply what our legislation does, it says that such a school district has to have a safe environment for kids. That's all. Got to have a policy requiring criminal background checks for all the school workers, any adults who have unsupervised contact with children. And if a person applies for a job with such a school and it turns out that they have been convicted, not alleged, but convicted of a serious crime, including murder, rape, or any violent or sexual crime against children, then such a person may not be employed at a school in a capacity where they would have unsupervised access to children. So, as I say, this applies only to those school districts that receive impact aids, that is to say, those school districts that receive money to help compensate them for the fact that they are educating our military families' children. It's about 17% of America's school districts receive this impact aid. It's roughly 8.5 million kids. And the legislation also applies to the DoD-operated schools, right? So the Defense Department operates its own schools to educate the children of our military personnel. To the credit of the Defense Department, it is already their own internal policy to require these appropriate background checks that are rigorous enough to make sure that we stop a violent predator from being hired in this capacity. But because it's just internal policy, it could change, enforcement could lapse. So what our legislation does is it codifies it. It says this is the right thing to do, let's codify it. And since it is the right thing to do, and we're doing it at our DoD schools, let's also do it at the other schools that are educating our military families' kids. Mr. President, I don't think this should even be controversial. It's, the Pennsylvanians that I talk to, they don't think this is controversial. They think we should, of course, insist that our schools are at least as safe an environment as we can make them. And while the men and women are providing the enormous service to all of us, the sacrifice they make by wearing the uniform, committing to serving in our armed forces, don't we owe it to them to provide the level of protection that we can provide to their kids? I think we do. And in addition, it shouldn't be controversial because substantively, this isn't anything new. Last year, every member of Congress but one, the vote was 523 to 1, right? The House and the Senate passed almost identical background check legislation with respect to daycare workers at that worked for a daycare that got funding through the Child Care Development Block Grant Bill. So in other words, we've already agreed with one dissenting vote out of 100 senators and 435 House members, there was one dissenting vote. Every other senator and House member, both sides of the aisle, agreed that this level of background check security ought to be provided for very young kids. Why wouldn't we do it for slightly older kids, the kids who are in primary and secondary schools as well? So despite that, Mr. President, there is opposition. There's opposition. Just last week, the senior senator from Illinois came to the House floor to criticize my legislation. He stated, and I quote, "This provision fails to provide adequate due process and civil rights protections for innocent individuals," end quote. So I want to address this, Mr. President, because I couldn't disagree more. First of all, it's important to note, our legislation, the legislation that forbids the hiring of these pedophiles, people who have committed these terrible crimes against kids, it applies only if the applicant has been convicted of a crime. If you've been alleged or rumored to have, that's not what the legislation contemplates. It's only someone who's been convicted. Now, the last time I checked, our criminal justice system is loaded with due process rights. In order to get a conviction, we have very elaborate processes that someone can avail themselves of. And of course, they always do. So nobody's been convicted without having had the opportunity for all of us to pay for their lawyer to defend them, for instance, if they need to have a jury trial if they want to do that. All the civil rights guaranteed throughout the Constitution and all the right, it's all there. So due process, they've already had enormous due process, or they couldn't have been convicted. But our legislation goes even a step beyond that. What we do is we say that the applicant is entitled to a copy of the background check, so they get full disclosure of whatever was discovered, and the school district must have an appeals process if the applicant, if it turns out the applicant is denied. Because we acknowledge it's conceivable that there could be a mistake, right? It could be like the wrong John Smith who's applying for a job at a school. There could be an error of some sort. So in the first place, you have to have been convicted, and in the second place, you get to appeal this. What more due process is necessary than that? What more? Well, I can tell you, because we've had this debate before, and some on the other side have suggested that they want something that I don't even think qualifies as due process. It's a totally different category, but they call it due process. What they want is a carve-out. They want a little mini-trial. They want to give the convicted pedophile the opportunity to make the case for why an exception should be made in his case. It's unbelievable to me. But how do I know? I know this because last year, there were 39 special interest groups sent a letter to the U.S. Senate asserting that it's just unfair to deny even a convicted child molester a teaching job. They wrote this. I'm going to quote from the letter briefly. It says, and I quote, "We believe that individuals who've been convicted of crimes and have completed their sentence should not be unnecessarily subjected to additional punishments because of these convictions." So let's think about what they're saying here. The logic is, what they're explicitly saying is a person could be convicted, that person could admit to and be convicted of raping a child, serve a sentence, walk out of the prison, go down the road to the local elementary school and apply for being a teacher, and they should be hired. That's unbelievable to me. Now, I'm not suggesting that the pedophile should never be eligible to do any work at all, and never have any job. That's not what I'm saying. But how about we keep them away from young kids? Is that really unreasonable? That's all we're asking for. That's what we're saying. Now, we've got other colleagues who object to this notion, this legislative approach, on the grounds that it offends their sense of federalism. They think that we should leave it to the states to decide whether or not and to what extent the states and school district will protect kids from predators. Well, I strongly disagree with that for many reasons. we might well have an extended debate about that, but let me just give two brief ones. First of all, I think we have an oversight responsibility. I think the Pennsylvanians who send me here and know that I'm casting votes on how we're going to spend their tax dollars expect that I'm providing some kind of oversight such that, for instance, their tax dollars aren't used to hire a pedophile in a school. I think that would not be a controversial notion with my constituents. But the second thing is, the folks who are hung up on the federalism issue, they insist that, well, every state is free to do what they want to do. They have to be able to pass whatever laws or not as they see fit. Well, what about the military family that can't determine which state they don't get to pick the state that they're based in, not always. They're in a state, it's not their native state. They're assigned to that base in a particular state, and they got to live with whatever the laws are there. Don't we agree that every child in America deserves to have protection from these predators? I do. Now, our legislation doesn't go that far. I wish it did. We tried, and I'm not going to give up. But can't we at least provide that security for the children of our military families? That's what our legislation does do. Again, I want to thank Chairman McCain. He has been a consistent advocate for providing this level of protection to children. He was a co-sponsor of my legislation that prohibited passing the trash. His support was essential in getting it passed last year, and I am really proud and grateful to him to work with me to incorporate the language from my legislation into our NDAA legislation. I would strongly urge my colleagues, Mr. President, it's past time to act on this. As I said, Senator Manchin and I have been pushing this for 2.5 years, and in that time, another 1,150 school employees have been arrested for sexual misconduct with the kids they're supposed to be taking care of. Clearly, we're not doing enough. And we really need to ask ourselves, how much bigger does that number have to get? How many more children have to have their childhood ruined? How many families need to be torn apart before we're willing to take this measure? I would argue we've seen more than enough. The children of America have seen more than enough, and the children of the men and women who wear the uniform of this country, who make the sacrifice to defend and protect all of us, absolutely deserve this protection. So I hope we will pass this defense authorization bill with this language intact, and I once again want to express my appreciation of the chairman for putting it into the base text, and I yield the floor.